Welcome back to the Go to the Field podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Wormert.
I'm Eric Osland.
So, back in the studio today, we've got Matt Geiger. He was in recently on Victrado when we discussed it, the new seed treatment from Syngenta. So, Matt's also, we talked about being a great influence out in the countryside, having a lot of boots on the ground expertise, looking at a lot of different products. One thing that I think we need to discuss with listeners, and we've had several discussions about this, I know last summer when we were spraying fungicides specifically, but then also the adjustment of your pH in your spray solution. There's a lot of claims going out there that we need to adjust that pH down, I don't know, to a 5 or maybe even a little bit less to get the most effectiveness out of our pesticides. And I think a lot of products are lumped into there, whether it's insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. So just thought we would maybe discuss that a little bit and then see what the true agronomic benefit is.
Yeah, Ryan. And I think one of the things to point out is, where did some of this originate from? I think that there was a newsletter article that was put out in the early 2000s from Purdue University. And the article was called "The Impact of Water Quality on Pesticide Performance." A chart that was contained in this article, just to explain it briefly, what it does is it tries to demonstrate the length of half-lives for herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides across various pH levels within the spray tank. And I guess if you don't know, the half-life is basically a measurement of a degradation of a compound. And in this chart, it shows that at higher pH levels, a fungicide might break down as quickly as 2 minutes. I think what is important to discuss is, what the original intent of that chart was, and compared to, I guess, how it's being used in the chart that's floating around the countryside. And really just, have a discussion is pH adjustment really needed to stabilize some of these products? And that's why I think, it's great to have Matt here, somebody that works for the manufacturer of these products and can give us a little bit of insight. I know they've had conversations or he's addressed this with their formulation chemists, and, those formulation chemists at the manufacturers are some of the smartest people in agriculture, and to ignore these types of things is just something that they don't do. And I think Matt has some insight there. And so I guess, from your perspective, are these claims, or is there any validity to the claims that we need to adjust pH, and what is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this has really popped up in the last, 12 months, would you guys say?
Yes.
There is some validity to it in regards to certain active ingredients. If you were to read the chart, there's an older fungicide that people might know as Captan fungicide. That's old, and we don't use that in row crops in our part of the world. So yeah, there are some AIs out there that are influenced by pH, and a lot of those are called out on the labels. Certain older ALS chemistries, for example, like ALS herbicides, they may call for AMS. AMS lowers your pH, because some of those might like a more acidic solution for performance. But if you look at some of these charts that have came out, there's a very popular active ingredient in the fungicide market, propiconazole. People might know that as tilt fungicide. So that's in Trivapro, that's in Miravis Neo, that's in Quilt Excel. If you read their charts, stable at a pH of 5 to 9. How often are you going to find a pH in the Midwest that's out of that range? And even if it was, I talked to our chemists. These people are, to Eric's point, are highly intelligent. They're basically, in some cases, taking active ingredients that are a rock. They're a solid substance, and they're turning it into a sprayable, mixable form. So, I hope listeners don't think that our chemists aren't thinking about these kind of things. We know that the pH of everywhere is not distilled water. The pH varies, and these products are sprayed, all over the world in some cases. So our chemists are taking this into consideration. So our formulations actually have buffering systems built into them. We know, quote unquote, ideal pH is between 5 and 7, but that doesn't mean these products can't work outside that range. We have buffering systems built into them to help with performance if that is an issue. And we ask them directly because they test these kind of things. My understanding is we've tested pH anywhere from 3 to 10 in our labs and have seen no significant levels of degradation in these products. So that's a little bit from a scientific standpoint, but I just kind of want to talk from a commercial standpoint. We've been selling fungicides successfully really since, I would say, we launched these modern chemistries like Trivapro and our Mirva sprains, these SDHI containing molecules. And we've seen such a high level of consistency out of these brands. So, a lot of cases they're mixed at the plant, 2 gallons per acre, and they sit in an airport for an entire day sometimes. You can get a lot of acres out of a load. So that sits for a long time. So if you think about that, who would use fungicide if it didn't work? If it's got a half-life of 2 minutes or what are some of these reports say, our fungicide sales would be almost nothing. Should you load the plane at the plant, just pull it into the bay and pull it out so you can get it sprayed ASAP? So I guess I just don't fully understand or believe that this pH is such a significant issue because our products just wouldn't work. Our average this year in our Southern Illinois district of treated versus not treated with Trivapro fungicide, Mirva fungicide was plus 31 bushel. So the fungicide responses have been huge, amidst all this pH talk. So I went on a bit of a rant there, but
you mentioned that, man. I think it's a good point, and I don't remember who I was having this conversation with, but at one point when some of this was coming up, it's like when I walk out to my truck in the morning and I drive to work and make sure that my tires aren't all flat because I want to make it to work. That's kind of the way that these formulation chemists look at accounting for pH in the products that they're developing. It's second nature to them. It's nothing that would catch them off guard. They are constantly focused on, the stability of these products and making sure that across the diversity of pHs and temperatures and water quality that the product is going to be exposed to, that it's going to be stable and that it's going to perform. And then the only other thing I guess that I would say on that is in certain situations, if there is a need to adjust pH or, if there is a modification that's needed to the carrier for these products, that's going to be accounted for in the label. So that's kind of the number one thing I guess I would tell a grower who is, looking into something like this is to read the label for the product that you're using. And if it doesn't recommend or mandate a particular adjuvant or a particular, water modifier, then it probably isn't needed for the performance of that product.
I think that's where the chart that Purdue put out is being misconstrued a little bit. It's lumping all these herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides into one category, which it's not. They're all different. They all have a different requirement. Majority of them have a broad requirement for pH. So I think, and like you said, the chemists, they are accounting for this and what that formulation is and what it requires to be effective agronomically. So we even reached out to the people that, worked on this publication from Purdue, and they mentioned too that it's not to turn a blind eye to water quality. That is the overall thing. And pH is a part of that water quality. And then if there is a requirement on the label, we need to be cognizant of it and make sure we're addressing it. But at this stage, with the modern products and everything that we use now, I think we're addressing it just fine to get the most agronomic benefits out of these products that we're pushing out in the marketplace.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Ryan, the people at Purdue were kind of surprised and maybe even a little bit discouraged at the way some of this information was being used in the countryside. Part of that is we were talking about fungicides, but some of this conversation has reached into other products as well, like herbicides. And we know that herbicides require certain additives. With glufosinate, we want to make sure that we have AMS in there with that product. We also know that some of these products do work better at a more acidic pH, like glyphosate, for example, is one that works very well or is going to perform better when the pH is lower. But we did a test with this during the summertime. We started out with a gradient of pHs, and we modified those pHs, I think, from a 6 up to an 8. And then when we added the quart of glyphosate to those simulated tank mixes, every single time that glyphosate lowered the pH down to a 5. And it kind of goes back to what we've talked about so far, and I think Matt was talking about this, and maybe Ryan said it too, but these products have built-in buffering systems, and those buffering systems are designed by the formulation chemist because they're going to formulate that product to get down to the pH that it's going to work at the best.
I know this information is a little dated, but for an example, metolachlor, which has been around for a while and it's included in a lot of Syngenta products out there, the pH range for it is from 2 to 10 is where it's stable, and it's viable for greater than 200 days. So the chart that Purdue put out has brand X herbicide, and then at a pH of 9, it's only viable for 10 minutes. So it's not necessarily right for every herbicide, and to lump those all together, you cannot do that. So you have to look at each individual label to get the specific needs.
And one thing I'll add, I don't work for Equity, but when we make certain products like our herbicides, our fungicides, for example, we don't include, surfactant in those formulations. That's a product that you guys sell to the end user that we know the product needs. We know it needs adjusted, based on the water volumes as well. So we're not against leaving certain ingredients out of our formulation to be added at the plant. We're not against adjuvants. If our products needed an adjuvant added to them, we would put that on the label. We recommend adjuvants all the time. Like most of our applications that we make, we recommend an adjuvant with it. So if it needs it, we're not against recommending it. But we as the manufacturers of products that are sold across, I would say, millions of acres, we would recommend it if we knew we needed it. We make it. Our chemists understand these things, to your guys' point.
I would assume your goal as a manufacturer is to get your products to perform at the best of their ability for the customer. And that's how you get repeat sales, right?
Yeah, we talked on the Victrado seed treatment episode. It cost us around $300 million to get a new product to the market. You think we want it to underperform when it took us 17, 18 years to get our first dollar back on that investment? We want things to work as good as possible. So if we knew we needed a pH modifier in these things, you bet we'd be recommending it. And so a question for you guys, I work for Syngenta. What are other manufacturers saying on this topic?
A lot of similarities. A lot of them, say that the manufacturing piece, they have the buffering built into that formulation to where they can adjust. So, and it's a lot of common adjuvants that they require, whether it calls for an NIS, you put that in there. If it calls for ammonium sulfate, that's what they recommend as well. So, which brings up another point too. A lot of these pH adjusters, or a few of them I know, are also known as water conditioning agents. So, and then they're also recommended at maybe 2 to 3 ounces per acre. It's hard to replace AMS, and in a glufosinate application, it's pretty tough. I mean, you need that ammonium in there to overload the plant.
Yeah, I think we've discussed this on another episode of the podcast as well, and feel free to go back and listen to that. But yeah, I mean, water conditioning is only one, I wouldn't say small, but one part of what AMS is adding to that spray tank, and it's doing so much more in terms of, helping overload the ammonia, and also helping to transport that active ingredient into the actual plant tissue. And some of these all-in-one types of adjuvants and water conditioners that just don't have the ability to do those types of things. So, there's a whole nother can of worms that we could go into of all the different things that's needed in a spray tank. But at the same time, we don't necessarily want to spend money and be putting things in the spray tank that aren't needed, that aren't providing value and benefit. And frankly, I've heard of situations, and some of these pH modifiers can be somewhat affordable, but I've also heard situations where these pH modifiers can be, upwards of $5 to $10 per acre to get these tank mixes where that chart or whoever's advising them to adjust it to be. So you can drive up a lot of cost that's not necessarily providing any benefit.
So we talked about the pH in the degradation and the half-life. Obviously, built into the product and the formulations to help us get the longevity out of there, because it's pretty hard to get everything mixed up out to the field and applied before, like that chart shows, it would be up in potentially 3 hours. But there are some things that we can do, to help prolong some of that. If you've got a product that's mixed up in a tank and it's a plastic see-through poly tank, and it's going to be parked outside for a long time, I think you want that hidden from the sun to where you can get the UV degradation, which could be more beneficial than what it is from a pH standpoint. Is that fair?
Yeah, and it depends. Once again, it depends on the active ingredient as well. So you think about an active ingredient like lambda-cyhalothrin, that's in our Warrior 2 with Xeon Technology insecticide. We encapsulate that with zinc to prevent UV degradation. But you get some of these generic products that have the same active ingredient but don't have the encapsulation. Those can be degraded by UV light a little more rapidly. So, it goes back to the same thing as, modifying these fungicides like you talk about. It depends on the pH. And some pesticides aren't UV light sensitive. So, it's probably best to be safe to park it in the shade. But, we've done testing when, a nurse truck sits for a while, because we know, we've had enough time to test our products. It doesn't always get sprayed that day. You get rained out, there's fog, something breaks down. It could sit for a couple of days. So once again, we don't want you guys to be hung with a load of junk product. We can't afford that, and you guys can't afford that. So we've looked into all these things, and we know we've got good stability, even if you can't spray it that day. But I would say best practice, just in case, maybe you could park in the shade, but I'd say some of the generic insecticides like lambda-cyhalothrin could be more of like a UV degradation issue. This isn't a huge point because we've got these buffering systems built into our products, but folks always talk about the pH of the water. What you want to look at is the pH of the finished spray solution after everything is already in the tank. So it's a bit of a moot point of what the pH is of the water beforehand. You want the pH of your finished spray solution when everything's in the tank. And even then, we've got these buffering systems to help these products work. But if you're that worried about this, I'll call it a conspiracy theory of this pH, test your finished spray solution instead, not just the water only.
Matt, I guess I have one question that I think I would have if I was using and purchasing these products. So some of these products maybe don't address pH at all on the label. So it's not saying like, hey, I have it between a 9 and a 5 or anything. It just doesn't even address pH. So in those situations, can a grower assume that it's just something that they don't really need to worry about because the buffering system is going to account for whatever that pH is?
Yes, I would agree with that. And you think back to some of these older chemistries, like we were talking earlier, these sulfonylurea ALS chemistries. Some of those are affected by pH. And that was back in the 80s. This pH of water thing is not new. Chemists have been looking at this for a long time. And if something is a non-issue, it's just not on the label. If it is an issue, we put it on there, because essentially think of a label as instructions. It's telling you how to best use the product. It's an instruction manual, essentially. So Eric's been reading through a few fungicide labels, and he found a fungicide that's very old. And, just kind of to further our point a little bit, he wanted to read a little bit of the excerpt from the Captan fungicide label.
Looking at the Captan label here, and it calls this out specifically, that alkaline materials such as spray lime, lime sulfur, and a Bordeaux mixture will reduce the fungicidal activity of Captan 80WDG. So again, these statements are going to be called out specifically on the label, and probably, if you look through the Triva Pro or the Mirvis brand products, you're not going to see these statements called out specifically. So those are the types of things that you need to watch out for on these labels.
Did it call out high pH directly on the label, or alkaline spray solutions, or how did it word it?
So it calls out specifically alkaline materials. I'm not seeing anywhere where it calls out pH directly. So it can maybe sometimes be a little bit not hidden, but maybe not worded the way that you think that it might be. So those are just a couple of things to watch out for. We watch these things very closely at the Equity. If there is a needed adjustment to be made, your Equity salesman will work that through with you and make sure you have that information.
Yeah, so alkaline spray solution, higher than 7 pH, right? So an old fungicide like that, My God, I think I did a quick Google search. This may not be accurate information, but this is saying it came out around 1951. I don't know when this label was written, but that's one of the oldest fungicides there is, and it called it out on the label.
And I'm sure in 1955, the technologies that exist right now for buffering these products in the jug probably didn't exist. So that's where a lot of this is coming from. And again, even the Purdue article was relatively old as well. So just some information on that.
I think we've come a long way in formulations. The chemists better each year because they're wanting to improve products every year. If you're worried about pH, it's good to look at the label for specific instructions, and normally that's listed under mixing instructions or directions for use. So that would be a good spot to look, and make sure that your specific fungicide, insecticide, or herbicide that you're planning to use does not have any certain restrictions. I know at the Equity, we look at that pretty close on the products that we recommend to make sure that there's no specific instructions that we are overlooking. So we watch that pretty close and make sure that we're giving good recommendations. And I think that's the same way for the Syngenta group, Matt, that you guys look at that as well. If there was something, you guys would provide us with that information if there's actions that need to be taken. So, and we would definitely follow those instructions as well. Because the goal at the end of the day is to get our products to work the best we possibly can for you guys in the countryside.
Some active ingredients are affected by pH, but it's taken into account by the formulations or looking under the mixing instructions that require an adjuvant to help out with that. But the active ingredients that we're using in row crop corn and soybean fungicide and insecticide applications, I just don't see that we need to do this pH modification with the addition of an extra product. So, and if it needed it, we would recommend it.
Yeah, and if you run into questions in season with this, don't hesitate to reach out to your Equity salesman, and they can get a hold of the manufacturers and make sure that whatever you're putting in that tank is gonna do the best job possible. But yeah, with that, thanks again, Matt, for joining us today. If you have any questions, again, reach out, and we'll catch you next time.